Well, as you can see behind me, the leaves are dwindling down to a precious few. It's fall. And as fall comes, it becomes more likely you're going to spend more time inside. So today we're going to talk about some of our documentaries that we have here at the ICPL. Some are new, some are old, but it's a place that you can browse and you'll always find something fun. So let's start with some heavy-duty stuff. If you haven't seen the Tillman story about Pat Tillman, and if you don't know the story, he was killed by friendly fire in the early days of the Gulf War. The story is a very intriguing story, and I would also recommend that you read his wife's book along with this, but this has more stuff from his mom, and his mom became a very big advocate about getting the truth out. And this is really about kind of her story more than it is about his wife's. His wife wrote a great book. I thought it was a really good book, but anyway, the Tillman story, it's very moving. It's very sad, so if you're kind of down, probably not the best documentary to watch, but if you're interested in how the government sometimes lies to its people, there you go. Madoff Affair. We have another documentary about the Madoff done by independent documentary maker, but this is Frontlines, and this is just as good. It kind of sets it up and how the whole thing worked. The Madoff thing is kind of complicated if you don't understand finance and Ponzi schemes and stuff. But this guy is a crook, and he was a crook. And the other documentary shows that this firm that investigated these kind of situations found him out about 3 years before he turned himself in. And Madoff has kind of reaped what he's sown. Unfortunately, both of his sons are now dead, and he has no family because his wife is estranged from him, and he got lucky that he's in prison, I guess, if that's luck. But he's still scum, and this is a very good documentary. It's Frontline PBS, and PBS has announced that they're not going to do as many documentaries in the next few years. They're going to concentrate on series, which is too bad, but Frontline is a great show. Okay, if you grew up in the Midwest or you've been around here for a long time, you know who John Zelensky is. This is about how John Zelensky was persecuted and was, let's see, he's blacklisted. And since it's Banned Books Week coming up and Intellectual Freedom Festival, take your own take on this. Documentaries can be biased, and they may not reflect what is reality, but it's an interesting watch. I'd say read, but it's not a book. So it's an interesting watch. I tend not to believe it since I sort of know some of these stories, but it's worth your time. So we're going to go to some well-known social people in our documentary. Deanna Vierlin, The Eye Has to Travel. This gal was the former editor of Vogue and quite the character, and wonderful stuff that they have in this documentary that was taken from talk shows that she was on and from people who she worked with, and she had a bon vivant type of attitude towards life. And basically she ran Harper's Bazaar, then she ran Vogue, and then she was fired from Vogue and able to get Anna Wintour in there right now. Just an interesting story. She later became a curator at the Metropolitan Museum of Art and basically started their costume collection, and that is the one that brings in the money for the museum now. And so it's really interesting. She's a very interesting woman too, about social changes and how women in the job force, and even though she's had a very nice life, it was tough for her too. But it's a good documentary. I really enjoyed that. I watched that one twice. One of my favorite documentaries, Whatever Happened to Kerouac. This is a story about Jack Kerouac. A lot of people who are gone now are on this. Gregory Corso and the guy that wrote Naked Lunch, Burroughs, and Allen Ginsberg, and just a lot of people talk about Jack Kerouac. And there's some great footage of Neal Cassady on here, because I don't think they've really written the story about Neal Cassady yet. But Kerouac and Cassady, Andy and Barney, you know, it's kind of one of those two groupings. They made each other in this. And Kerouac, what happened to Kerouac, it's interesting. They do a lot of clips from his last appearance on television, which was on Firing Line with William Buckley, and he was drunk, and he came off as a real butt, but he was Kerouac, and that's how he was in the end of his life. So interesting stories. A lot, like I said, a lot of the people that were in this are gone now, and it's just, if you just know Kerouac from his writings. The man is interesting too, and this kind of introduces you to him. Scattered My Ashes at Bergdorfs, another fun, it's a documentary about a store, and a documentary about a lot of people who use that store and why it's important. And when I was growing up, department stores were a big deal, and you went to a department store and you dressed up, and like Yonkers downtown had a lady who ran the elevator, and the women all had to wear dresses, and it was all very proper, and you could sit in a chair, and people smoked and tried on clothes, and it was very interesting. And this is dying out, but Bergdorfs hasn't died out. If you go to New York City, it's worth the walk through. Anyway, but this is a fun one. This is something, if you want to spend a couple minutes looking at something that's entertaining, this is very entertaining. And speaking of entertaining, the most entertaining woman that ever was a comic, Joan Rivers, piece of work. After Joan died in 2014, PBS actually broadcast this, but they cut a lot of it. So I would recommend watching the whole thing. This woman worked her butt off to get where she was, and she did not have an easy climb in a field where there were only 4 comics before her, women comics: Phyllis Diller, Toady Fields, Rusty Warren. Then you had Joan, and Joan really did make the way for modern comedians. And she was a hard worker, and she got what she wanted, and sometimes she didn't get what she wanted. And her talking about her treatment by Johnny Carson after she went and did her own show on Fox, it's very sad the way that Carson treated her. But she rose above it. Her husband's suicide, she rose above it. Making a life for her and her daughter, she did it, and she was tough when she did it. So I have to say, it's well worth it. She's funny in it. There's a scene in here where you wonder where comedians get what they get in order to go out on a stage, and it was shortly after 9/11, and she's doing a stage act, and a guy heckles her, and she shoots him down, and it's worth watching the whole documentary just for that scene. It's towards the end, and she tells him what comedy does. Very good documentary. Here's a fun one too, I Know That Voice. I Know That Voice features a lot of people. You'll know the voice, but you've never seen the face. And it's really a great documentary in the sense that you get to learn something about these people and why they do what they do, and how it's it's appreciated, but it's not really glamorized or anything. But you'll recognize a lot of voices. June Fogy has since passed away, or June Foray, who did Rocky and Bullwinkle. I think she did Rocky, and she did a number of other like Disney stuff. You'll recognize that voice, and she has a lot of insights about this. But I recommend this because it's just something that's fun and something that makes you learn. Watch and learn. That's what documentaries are about. I had the privilege to see Elaine Stritch in New York City doing I had the privilege of seeing her do her at Liberty show. And if you don't know what that kind of format is, and I believe we still have that DVD, I'm not sure, I didn't see it up to pull it, but it's where somebody comes out, has been in the business for a long time. They talk about show business, they talk about what they're doing, and Carol Burnett's doing it right now. She goes out and she talks about being an entertainer. Elaine Stritch is a consummate entertainer. And this basically follows her around when she was shooting the show with Tina Fey that she was Alec Baldwin's mother in, 30 Rock. And then she also, it's the last appearance in film by James Gandolfini, who worked with her on some stuff. But it's also about her process of how she worked. And she had diabetes for a long, long time. And you actually see a couple of incidents where she goes into sugar shock. And if you don't live with a diabetic and you don't know what that's like, you see it here. And it's tough, and it changes your outlook, and it changes how she approached doing her work, because you work at night and you're trying to maintain blood sugar levels. But it's also about a trooper, and she was a trooper. She passed away last year, and Broadway closed down. Well, they shut all their lights off in her honor, which is very rare for them to do that. So, and she's funny, very funny lady. On to music. 17 years old, 1967, The Letter. Alex Chilton comes into the American consciousness. Alex Chilton, child genius, child performer. He was just the Box Tops great group from the 60s. He went on to do this independent stuff. Big Star was the band that he founded in the 70s, and Big Star influenced so many rock bands in the 80s, from the Replacements to REM to Elliott Smith to Beck to name an alternative band in the 80s, and no doubt Big Star is on there. The Replacements, in fact, wrote a song called Alex Chilton from Pleased to Meet Me, and it's a great song. And the ironic thing is, wouldn't it be cool if he died in Memphis? He didn't die in Memphis, but it was cool. He lived his life the way he wanted to, and it's about Big Star and why Big Star, everybody loved Big Star, and it was a big group and influential, but they didn't make any money. And a little bit more about Alex Chilton. Good documentary, enjoyed it a lot, and about a band that I knew about but didn't really know about. So open your minds and learn some stuff. If you didn't get to see the PBS documentary on the Dave Clark 5, it's good. It's really good, even though Tom Hanks is in it and kind of, takes over like Tom Hanks does on documentaries. They also talk to people like Stevie Wonder and Springsteen and Elton John and people like that, and about Dave Clark, but the Dave Clark 5. Dave Clark is the only surviving member of the Dave Clark 5 now. And he did something really smart. He bought the rights to all of his music, and he kept those rights. He didn't sell them in any deals, A.A. Paul McCartney, or didn't trade them for different money situations like other people did. So he controls the Dave Clark 5 music catalog. Can you find Dave Clark 5 out in the world? No, because he only releases it a little bit at a time, or at various parts of the time. They think after he passes that a lot of this stuff will be available. I kind of think he's got some controls on that, even from the beyond. But this is really good. It features all of their performances, like on Ed Sullivan and Hullabaloo. And when I want to think, the top of the Pops and a couple other shows that were British music, like Bandstand was and Shindig was for the Americas. England had several shows like that. Dave Clark bought all the rights to all those shows, so he also controls that. Still alive, still kicking, interesting man, very proper English, which is very interesting. And it's also a drummer is the lead person in a band. So rare, not since Karen Carpenter followed, but interesting. And it takes you through the 60s, but it also takes you through the British invasion. And Dave Clark 5 is very important to the British invasion. Capturing that time of the year, or that part of history, is Henry Diltz. And this is a great documentary about, he was in the music business and then he started taking pictures. His most famous album cover is probably Morrison Hotel from The Doors. And he took everybody. He took pictures of everybody, still does take pictures. But he has been nominated for the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. I believe he will probably get in someday. Just classic stuff. They did interviews with him and with all, there's a nice interview with Joni Mitchell in this. And so it's good to see her in stuff. She's not in a lot of documentaries, but it's talking about all the stuff that he does. And very interesting in the sense that it just happened for him. He just picked up a camera and took a couple of pictures and somebody bought them. And the next thing you know, he's a photographer, and he's a major rock and roll photographer. And he's very intellectual and he understood his situation. He understood what privilege he had at the time that he had it. He had this insight. So very, very good. Okay. Greatest song ever written, period, on October 4th, I believe, will be the 40th anniversary of the release of Bohemian Rhapsody. Queen. This is almost 3 hours. It's a documentary about Queen. You don't have to be a Queen fan to enjoy it. What I like about this documentary is it goes back in their early days and talks about when they were all in school. Now, Queen really did die when Freddie Mercury did. And Freddie, of course, is the first major rock star to have died of AIDS. I got to see it. It was my first concert. I got to see Queen. I'm very excited about that. Okay, so this talks about how the struggles they had, and people didn't believe they played their instruments. They thought they were all electronic. They talked about putting together songs like Bohemian Rhapsody and the whole Queen catalog. They talked about how they got to the top in the Americas with the Game, and then how quickly they fell with Hot Space. And talked also about Freddie's illness a little bit, not so much that overwhelms the Queen documentary. Some Queen documentaries that overwhelms it. This is about the 4 members. And after Freddie passed, John Deacon said, "I'm done with Queen, I'm done with this." He retired, and he doesn't do anything about but he is on here, and so that's rare, because mostly it's Roger Taylor and Brian May who talk about Queen. And like the Beatles, they sometimes differ in what happened. But a good documentary, but it is 3 hours long, so probably one you would start and then stop and start again. Okay, so let's go to some new stuff that has just come up. Dior and I. Story about Raf Simone. He has taken over he's the artistic director at Christian Dior, and it's about his first collection. So if you're into fashion, or if you're kind of into, here's somebody trying to do something different with an established brand, it's an interesting story. And there's a lot of pressure on this guy, and see what happens. I recommend that one. Supermensch. And I just happened to be looking through this, and Mike Myers directed it. So I'm like, oh, that's interesting. But who the hell is this guy? Well, it's Shep Gordon, who started as Alice Cooper's manager. He went on to become a film producer. He managed Blondie, and he managed Luther Vandross, and he's had this career. He has all these friends. He lives in Hawaii, and he's had this life that is just absolutely fascinating, and it takes you from the early 70s to now. Interesting guy. I didn't know anything about him and how important he was, but he is important in rock music, not just for bringing the world Alice Cooper, but also for all the stuff that he did outside of that. I didn't know anything about him. That's what documentaries do. Documentaries will give you something that you didn't know anything about, and they'll just make it so that you want to know more. And so I wanted to see if there was a book about him. There isn't. But, you know, it's just really interesting, this guy. I mean, he went from music, and then he started doing celebrity chefs, and then he started doing movie producing, and he pretty much does what he wants to do, and he's always a success at it. I wish I could talk today. This is probably the best documentary of all of them that I'm going to talk about today. It's called The Internet's Own Boy. And when Aaron Schwartz died, both Rolling Stone and New York Magazine did profiles of him, and I couldn't figure out in those stories what he really had done. He was under investigation by the U.S. government, and he committed suicide. And in his 26 short years, he did a lot. And he did a lot to raise awareness about what the internet's capable of and what the internet can do. And it is it's told with his parents' permission, so you see a lot of films of him as a little boy and growing up. And it's told in the sense that he was a brilliant tech person, and he wasn't part of Silicon Valley. And he wasn't part of anything that you think of when you think of the internet. He was a rebel, but he wasn't a rebel with intent, malintent. And so when the government went after him, you had to ask why. And it's a sad statement on the government that they tried to keep this guy down. And you understand now why some people left this country with their knowledge and tried to tell people about what's going on. But it is an absolutely fascinating documentary. It will make you cry. I will tell you that right now. But it is worth watching. And I heard they're trying to make a movie about them. I hope they don't. I think the documentary stands up as a testament to this young man. And it is such a loss for us that he's not here anymore. Okay. So to end on a light note, this just came out. I am Chris Farley. And those of you who know Chris Farley knew him from Saturday Night Live, probably the infamous Chippendale sketch with Patrick Swayze. But Chris Farley, kid from the Midwest, troubled, sad, but he loved his family, he loved his work, and people kind of stood around and what happened to him? Why did he end up the way he did? And this documentary really does answer those questions. Why did he end up the way he did? And so I think it's a good sit down. His family's in it. Talk about growing up in the Midwest. You know, he grew up in Wisconsin, and you just see, if you lived in the Midwest for any period of time, you will see the Midwest in Chris Farley. There's fun stuff. There's a lot of clips and a lot of his characters. And there's some poignant stuff too from, like Lorne Michaels and Mike Myers and his family talking about him and about they couldn't really see and they couldn't really save him because he didn't project that to them. And David Spade comes off, whom I don't really like very much, but he comes off as compassionate in this. So I recommend this. It's brand new. So, and all the last few ones that I just showed you are all brand new DVDs here. But check the documentary section. I'll be back some other time with some other good stuff, but this is what we're doing this month, so thanks.